We have a multi-pronged approach to what is a very dynamic situation. We are addressing it across the Department of Homeland Security, across the federal government, with our state and local partners, and with our partners and allies south of our border.
The Biden administration's attempt to lift a Trump-era expulsion policy at the U.S.-Mexico border is blocked by a federal judge amid a record surge in migration into the United States. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. A public health order known as Title 42 will continue to be used by U.S. law enforcement to expel migrants at the southern border following a court ruling last week that blocked the Biden administration's attempts to lift the restrictions imposed by the Trump administration at the beginning of the pandemic. Title 42 was ostensibly put in place more than 2 years ago to protect the United States from the spread of COVID-19. Critics say its real purpose, though, was to stop immigration and curtail asylum claims originating at the U.S.-Mexico border. The law, which draws on a World War II-era Public Health Act, has since been used more than 1.8 million times to expel asylum seekers, some several times. According to data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, law enforcement agents prevented more than 1.6 million migrants from crossing the Mexican border in 2021. The court ruling last week by a Trump-appointed federal judge to keep Title 42 in place was celebrated by Republican lawmakers. Texas Senator Ted Cruz called it a huge win for Texas border towns and for our country. The Department of Justice, meanwhile, has announced that it is filing an appeal. Rodney Scott is the former chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. He helped implement the Trump administration's policy to expel migrants on public health grounds using Title 42. He joins me now. Rodney Scott, as a former chief of the U.S. Border Patrol under both President Trump and Biden, how do you see the current administration's decision to terminate the Trump-era directive and lift Title 42?
Yeah, like many of the policies with the Biden administration, it seems like it's not very well thought out. Title 42 is a health and human services authority. It's not an immigration authority. It's intended to prevent or slow the spread of COVID. But while we have cities around the United States that are going back into COVID restrictions, and we look around the globe and COVID is still a threat, it seems premature, and it's going to make the chaos on the border today even worse once it's rescinded.
You say COVID is still a threat. The administration says that COVID is now far more under control than it was when this was implemented, and one could argue that it never really was intended to slow the spread of COVID-19. In fact, you have public health experts that said that it never slowed the spread of COVID.
Yeah, and that's not true at all. I was in all those meetings early on, and while we talk about the spread of COVID, people think of it nationally, and that was a big part of it, but it was also to protect our very small medical infrastructure in the border communities and to protect our Customs and Border Protection personnel from day one. When you're at the border, we're dealing with people that have not really been following any kind of hygiene rules or separation. Many of them were not vaccinated, and that continues to be the issue today. It's not like going to a supermarket, in the interior of the U.S. You're talking an area where people are in very, very tight, confined spaces. They've been packed into rail cars many times or semi-trailers, and they've been in close proximity to many, many other people, and they're not really seeking out medical support, if you will, the first time they get a cold or a sneeze, like many other places. From the beginning, it was about COVID.
Hold on, but you're ignoring the central issue here. The head of the CDC at the time, Robert Redfield, enacted Title 42 over the reported objections of CDC scientists. In fact, Anthony Fauci, the top infectious disease expert, said immigrants were not driving up COVID cases.
Yeah, it's just simply not true. Like I stated, I was in those meetings. There were people in CDC, probably still are, that don't understand the situation at the border and that were hesitant to implement it initially. So we set up a trip down to the border. We took people, we showed them our stations, we showed them what we were dealing with on a daily basis. And that team came back and never once again pushed back. They said we definitely need to use Title 42. And we definitely need to make sure so that we're protecting the CBP personnel, we're protecting the border communities, and we're
But this was
preserving
not
that
about
very limited
protecting them,
hospital
though.
capability.
This wasn't really about protecting them, was it? I mean, how do you then justify and explain the fact that Stephen Miller, President Trump's senior advisor on immigration, floated the idea in the White House during meetings of enacting this sort of obscure law from 1944 known as Title 42 well before the pandemic in 2018?
So I can't address for what conversations took place when I wasn't in the room, but I was in the room with CDC. I was in charge of sending the team from CDC down to the border so they could make their own decision about what was going on.
But even if
We
you
had
weren't
done
in
a
the
short
room,
video.
how do you address
you
this?
interrupted. I'll
Even if
interrupt
you weren't
now.
in the room.
We did a short video and we showed if we had 1 or 2 people infected in one of our stations, the contact tracing, how many people that would infect, how many hospitals that would wipe out along the border. And it was CDC that made that decision based on science.
But you could make the case, though, couldn't you, that Title 42 never actually worked. The data, in fact, shows that the number of people apprehended at the border more than once by Border Patrol increased to 27% from the previous rate of 7%.
Title 42 is and continues to be a health-related policy. It is not about immigration. There were other policies in place that the Biden administration did take, they eliminated, that were in place to deal with the immigration. They're separate issues here. Title 42 was health. It continues to be a health issue. Before I left as chief, I believe there were 16 Border Patrol agents that died in the line of duty from contracting COVID from people they encountered. And I'm very confident that would have been significantly worse if we had not implemented the Title 42. So we're talking about in a more isolated area, protecting the personnel along the border, protecting the government employees, not necessarily the long-term spread. It was more the short-term spread of COVID. And I believe it was appropriate and that it worked.
What about those who say that it circumvents US and international law that protect asylum seekers and refugees, that the US and US law gives asylum seekers the right to seek asylum in the United States, even if they arrive without any prior authorization?
I'll let the lawyers argue that out. I've heard perspectives on both sides, and you always have critics. Around the world, it is not unreasonable to ask people. It's actually a norm to ask people to come to your front door when they enter your house. It's the same with the United States. We ask people to come to our ports of entry, announce their entry, and then we make decisions who and can come into this country. That is the normal border security immigration. Title 42 literally just said, hey, there's a short-term pandemic, ended up being longer, but still in the big picture, short-term. And we are going to restrict the flow of people into this country to make sure that we protect those that are already here.
But if this law was supposed to be used and meant to be used during a major health crisis, how long do you think it should be kept in place?
I think it should be based on the science. I honestly thought it would have been slowing down and we would be looking at terminating Title 42.
Well, the decision to implement it went against the science, though. The decision to implement it went against the science and what scientific experts had been advising the government.
Well, just like the rest of COVID, there's scientific experts that say everything from all across the whole spectrum. But what I want to remind anybody watching is whether you use Title 42 or not isn't about COVID in the US currently. It's about the conditions through which the migrants are traveling, and are they likely to be carrying COVID and then spreading COVID? That's the conversation. So the scientists need to look at Mexico, South America, Canada, specific transit locations or hubs, we call them, around the world where a lot of illegal migrants move through before they get here. That's what the science needs to look at. Most of the criticism I've heard from scientists in the US is focused on the US COVID situation, and they just don't understand global migration or border security. They're speaking out of turn.
Rodney Davis, good to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, while the Biden administration may be locked in a months-long legal battle over this issue, critics of the White House's decision to lift Title 42 say the government does not have a plan to deal with the current level of migration at the U.S.'s southern border.
There's an extensive plan on paper that includes a 6-pillar approach to planning for and preparing for the lifting of Title 42, including surging resources, personnel, transportation, medical support, facilities to support border operations.
That plan, presented in late April by Alejandro Mayorkas, the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, calls for an additional $2 billion to conduct security operations on the southern border and increase detention capacity from 13,000 to 18,000 migrants at any given time. Some Republicans in Congress threatened Mayorkas with impeachment, accusing him of lying during a congressional hearing.
And so my question to you, Mr. Secretary, are you testifying as you sit here today that the southwest border is secure?
Yes, I am, and we are continuing to work to make it more secure.
Meanwhile, 20 Republican-controlled states, led by Arizona, have filed lawsuits against the Biden administration, arguing that ending Title 42 would create chaos at the U.S.-Mexico border. Texas, which has the longest border with Mexico, is one of those states. Joining me now is Texas State Representative Eddie Morales. Representative Morales, your district has the largest stretch of the Texas border with Mexico. You're a Democrat, and yet you've been one of the most vocal opponents of President Biden's decision to lift Title 42. Why keep in place an expulsion policy that both the administration and health officials at the Centers for Disease Control say is no longer needed?
I think we need to use any resource available to us to address the issue of this migrant surgency. You know, if it's Title 42, I'm happy to take that banner and use that as a reason. You know, nobody understands the border better than those that live on the border. And I think that we can recognize that the issue is still prevalent. We have, you know, I think the numbers were 1,500 that are crossing daily just through the Del Rio sector alone of migrants. And you can imagine, we've been told, and we have video of Mexico on the Mexico cities, the counterparts to Eagle Pass and Del Rio, which are in my district. And they show a high number of migrants in tents, you know, in some warehousing that they're keeping them over there. And a lot of them are expecting to cross as soon as Title 42 ends. Some of them are not even waiting, and you're getting these numbers of in bunches of 100 to 200, you know, that are coming almost hourly.
But aren't you taking away their legitimate rights to seek asylum? And in fact, you say you need every resource you can have, but is this really about resources or manpower to deal with the number of migrants at the border? Because you've said in the past that you need more resources, yet you and other state lawmakers have approved a budget of $3 billion just last summer to send up to 10,000 troops to the border. So this isn't really about a lack of resources, it's about politics, isn't it? And some Democrats, like you, speaking to the anti-immigrant sentiment of many voters ahead of the elections.
Well, first, I'd like to clear up, I'm a first-generation immigrant myself. And I think that, you know, my parents, you know, I was born in Piedras Negras, Coahuila, right across Eagle Pass. And more importantly, when I was elected to do this job, I was elected to represent the constituents of House District 74. My main goal and objective is to make sure that I'm addressing and making sure that they are being taken care of, the citizens of House District 74. They come first, and I'm understanding their plight and their concerns. You know, this is a heartbreak. I've seen this, you've seen the kids, it's a humanitarian issue. There has to be a better way. And right now, we're only incentivizing the cartels and the human smugglers by using the river and exposing our law enforcement.
But isn't there a lot of fear-mongering, though? I mean, doesn't the narrative of imminent chaos, which we have heard many lawmakers use about the border and these migrants, serve a certain political electoral agenda?
I'm not basing it on any political agenda. I'm a public servant, and if this is like this very thing, I'm a Democrat, and I'm actually voicing my opposition to Biden's own plan, my own president that is a Democrat. And it's because I'm actually living it day in and day out and seeing it and hearing it from our citizens on the border itself, you know, representing 9 out of the 11 counties that share a border that are in my district, 9 out of the 14 counties that share a border with Mexico. I think it's important for me to make sure that I continue to fight the good fight for the constituents of House District 74. The migrants are exposing themselves to vulnerabilities. Many are dying also, even if they're able to cross the river, and then also exposing our law enforcement.
But again, the question is whether Title 42 should stay in place. It's a public health law. It was never intended to be an anti-immigration law, an indefinite law. But isn't that exactly what it's being used for, and why many want to keep it in place? Let's face it.
And again, whatever the basis is, I'm not fighting the legal argument of it. I'm just fighting the sense that it is a helpful tool that is being used at the time to be able to address the needs on the border. And if that's what's resulting in making these migrants stop for a little bit longer or consider their choices, I would much rather have Biden expand these land ports, work with the Texas governor. I've asked him to do the same so that we can have an orderly migration of these individuals and their applications being processed, but through land ports, not through our rivers. That is the key, an orderly migrant process.
The American Civil Liberties Union and many rights organizations say that continuing to, quote, manipulate this public health law is beyond cruel. They say there must be another way to deal with this issue. They say it isn't about public health and border security. It's about pandering to voters who have strong anti-immigration sentiments.
My goal, again, is to stop the influx of these migrants using the river to cross. We are incentivizing the cartels. We are incentivizing human smuggling. And that, to me, is a much bigger threat for these migrants than, using Title 42.
All right, Texas State Representative Eddie Morales, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Migration across the U.S.'s southern border has posed a significant challenge to successive U.S. administrations. But the number of migrants and the number of expulsions has risen sharply in recent years as instability and violence across the region has spiked. While migrants from Mexico still account for the majority of those who are turned back by U.S. Border Patrol, there is a growing number of migrants from other Latin American countries, as well as South America and the Caribbean. Last month, Title 42 was used to expel 97,000 migrants, a majority of them from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So what is driving the surge in migration at the border, and what legal recourse do migrants who cross the border into the United States really have? Joining me now from Mexico is Tyler Mattiace, researcher in the Americas Division of Human Rights Watch. Tyler Mattiace, you just heard a Texas lawmaker make the case to us for keeping Title 42 in place, saying that allowing migrants to cross the border essentially strengthens the drug cartels who are responsible for drug smuggling, for human trafficking and smuggling of migrants at the border. How do you respond to those arguments?
Hi, thanks for having me. Title 42 has nothing to do with drug cartels. It has nothing to do with drug smuggling. What we're seeing here with Title 42 is that the Trump administration and now the Biden administration have shut down access to asylum, to protection for people who are vulnerable families fleeing from violence and persecution in their home countries. Title 42 has prevented them from seeking that protection. And not only that, but it sent them either back to the countries that they're fleeing from, or it sent them to Mexico where they're facing serious violence and abuses.
But why are we seeing such a spike? The numbers of migrants trying to cross the border is apparently at its highest level in 2 decades. Your research has focused extensively on the immigration crisis and access to asylum. When you look at countries like Mexico, like Guatemala, that you have focused on and where so many of the migrants originate from, what is the driving factor behind this spike?
I think that's a great question. I think to understand the spike that we've seen in the number of migrants apprehended recently, which is the number that we're seeing, it's important to understand that that's the number of times that people were apprehended and not the number of individual people. So actually, Title 42 has had the effect of increasing the number of migrants that are apprehended because it returns people to Mexico and they attempt to cross again because these are people who have already traveled very far from their country. They can't go back to their country because they fear violence or death in their home country. And so they will continue attempting to seek protection. And so we're seeing really that these high numbers, quote unquote, really represent people who are being apprehended multiple times crossing the border, which is not something that happened prior to Title 42. Prior to Title 42, people who sought protection were able to make those claims and have those claims heard, which is a basic human right, and other people were sent back to their countries.
But so what kind of legal recourse do people have when they are being turned away, when their rights to seek asylum are not being respected? These expulsions are expected to continue for some time, since Title 42 will remain in place for the foreseeable future. What kind of impact is it having on these immigrant communities, and what kind of access to the law do they have?
The fact that they have no legal recourse is precisely what we're concerned about. Title 42 has prevented people from being able to take any action at all to appeal being expelled to places that they're fleeing from. What we have seen and what we do know is that the Biden administration is able to make exceptions to Title 42 for particularly vulnerable people.
And yet the Biden administration has continued the so-called Remain in Mexico policy. According to your organization, Human Rights Watch, the Trump administration sent more than 21,000 asylum-seeking children and their families to what you have called dangerous Mexican border cities. As many as 15,000 children are reportedly still stranded there under the Biden administration. There's about 5,000 unaccompanied children in U.S. federal custody. What are the conditions like that they live under and that they face?
The conditions are very poor, and I think it's important to know that those are the conditions that many people also are waiting in because they've been sent to Mexico under Title 42, or because they're waiting in Mexico because they're waiting to be able to seek protection in the United States. And they're in these dangerous border towns and border cities in northern Mexico on the US border, which are some of the most dangerous places in Mexico precisely because of drug cartels, which operate there not because of something Mexico does. They operate there because of US demand for drugs. But they've found a new way to make money now, apart from drug trafficking, which is they kidnap and extort migrants and asylum seekers who are waiting in these cities. And so people know that when they're sent to wait in these border towns and border cities in northern Mexico, the cartels are waiting for them, they're monitoring them, and in a very systematic way, they kidnap and extort the people who are there on the assumption that they might have a family member who is already in the United States who could pay a ransom.
Many Republicans and some Democrats who say that Title 42 is not an immigration tool, that it's being used solely for public health reasons. Have you seen anything to suggest that it has been applied evenly to all nationalities, including US citizens, as it was originally intended? Or is it being solely used to target certain immigrant communities?
I think it's been clear since day one that there is absolutely no public health basis for this policy, for Title 42. There's been no explanation of why asylum seekers would pose more risk to public health than any other group. And it's absurd to claim that they do. No medical authority has suggested that they do. And even the CDC under Trump, when Title 42 was first proposed, opposed the idea initially because they said there is no medical justification for it. And the way that it's been applied unevenly, allowing some people to cross the border while others don't, I think just reveals the fact that it was never about public health in the first place.
All right. Tyler Mattiace of Human Rights Watch, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Last week's federal court decision to uphold a rarely invoked law known as Title 42 of the Public Health Service Act of 1944 effectively keeps the US-Mexico border closed to asylum seekers. In addition to the legal and moral questions it raises, it also highlights the inconsistency between Joe Biden's campaign promise to restore asylum at US borders and the actual immigration policies his administration has implemented. It took almost a year and a half for President Biden to attempt to lift his predecessor's expulsion policy, despite the repeated warnings by human rights organizations that it violates both US and international human rights law. Human Rights Watch accused the Biden administration of being, quote, complicit in the rights violations of asylum seekers. While Congress originally kept any reference to immigrants out of the law's text when it passed it almost 80 years ago to avoid discrimination, today members of Congress from both parties are using the public health law as a political tool to appeal to segments of the electorate. Some Democrats who are up for re-election in the November midterms even joined Republicans in lobbying to keep Title 42 in place. And so, in short, it should come as no surprise that immigration is once again being weaponized in what has become a never-ending cycle of US elections. With immigration one of the key issues in any election, immigration reform will continue to be kicked further down the road until after the next election or the following one. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team in Washington. Thanks for watching.